In the previous two videos, we covered variable types, identifiers, and values. And regarding the issue of values, we covered what variable types can have what values and what the value range is there, as well as the memory allocation associated with that. In this video, we're going to be discussing assignments and expressions, and we've already covered assignments to a large degree. We've already covered what can be assigned to what. But there's some more details to work out here. But before we jump into our assignments and expressions, it's worth us covering constants. So in Java, we can make a variable final. It's one of the many keywords we can put in front of a variable declaration. And it's not hard to understand what this does. A variable being final means that once it has a value assigned to it, it cannot be modified. You can create a different variable and modify that's value, but we cannot alter the value that this variable references. Now, obviously, you can understand why we do this. If we had a constant like pi or some other mathematical constant, we would kind of not want our program to ever change that, and we'd want the compiler to give us an error if we ever tried to. Now, of course, this isn't the value of pi, but because we're an engineering school, I've decided to make pi 3. Now, there is a difference between something being constant and final and it being immutable. A string is immutable, but it is not constant. I can change the value of a string, kind of. What I'm actually doing is I'm creating a new string, but the variable, and then I'm telling the variable, you no longer reference the old string, you reference this new string. So it's immutable, but the variable can actually reference different values at different stages in your program. Whereas a final variable, the data value that it's referencing, it will always reference that data, and you cannot change it, at least not as far as we're concerned. Now, moving on to assignments and expressions. As I've stated, we've already covered an assignment. When we instantiate a variable, we can give it a value other than null, as long as that value is within the range that that variable can understand. So, and we've discussed what those ranges are. But what we haven't necessarily covered are expressions. So when I assign, say, 5 times 3 to a variable, that's not just an assignment. There's an expression that has to be evaluated before that assignment. What the compiler's doing is it's realizing there's an assignment, but before it just goes ahead and assigns the whole expression to the variable, it evaluates that expression. So up here you've seen me doing 2 assignments at once. That's still an assignment. There's no expression there. There's no calculation the compiler has to do. It just checks that the value can be assigned to the variable, and then it assigns it. Whereas in these 2 bottom here, we have both an assignment and an expression. And the compiler goes in, and it calculates the value of this expression based on these operators. Now, for now, we're just going to be looking at plus, minus, multiply, divide, and modulus operators. And we're not going to cover operator precedence just yet. We'll move on to that in the next video. But for now, you can just understand the compiler is going in and it's evaluating what this means. And it can do this with variables. It just takes the values involved, uses the operators, using operator precedence to get the value of the expression, and then it assigns it to the variable. And it's very important to realize the ordering here. We are first evaluating and then assigning. And we also have to understand that there are times when we can't assign with constants. Now, in our next video, we're going to cover operator precedence and some of the nitty-gritty of expression evaluation. For now, you just need to know that there's a difference between assignments and expressions, and that the compiler is evaluating the expression before it's doing the assignment. And obviously, these operators like divide, multiply, add, and subtract, we need to understand what they do before we can understand in what order they operate. So, before we go into our next video about what order they operate in, I'm just going to give a brief recap of what they do. Plus and minus are very straightforward. You add and subtract. I'm not going to thoroughly evaluate that, especially because they use the same symbols as normal. But it's worth noting that the asterisk and the slash are multiply and divide. And this can confuse some people because that's not the symbol we're used to using. Now, obviously the divide will have some issues if you're using integers, because sometimes the result of the division might be a decimal. And we'll talk about what happens when you divide two integers or you divide a float by an integer and what the actual value you receive is. But the operator that's likely new to many people who aren't familiar with programming is the modulus operator. And what this is essentially doing is it's getting the remainder when you divide a number by another number. So say I were to divide 5 by 2. Well, 2 goes into 4, but we're left with 1. So 5 modulus 2 would be 1. And this has a variety of quite useful applications. For instance, when we're trying to figure out if one number is divisible by another, we can modulus the first number by the second number, and if the result is 0, we know it's divisible. And you'll see this crop up quite a lot, and it's very important to be familiar with. That's this video done. In our next video, we're going to cover operator precedence and some of the more complicated parts of expression evaluation. So the order in which Java processes the various operators, as well as some of the quirks of using operators like divide with floating points and integers. And we may also cover casting, though that may be in a future video. And we will also discuss some of the shorthand operators involved in assignment in Java. Anyway, thank you for listening.